The streets of Paris were suffocating under a blanket of dust. The air, thick with the scent of smoke, carried the distant rumble of German tanks creeping ever closer to the heart of the city. There was no cheering, no triumphant march, just the hollow silence of an empire crumbling from within. The streets were still, except for the occasional hurried footsteps of civilians, eyes downcast, faces pale, as they sought refuge from the looming enemy. Overhead, the low hum of aircraft sliced through the gray sky, their engines a constant reminder that war was no longer an abstract fear, it was now a terrifying reality. And amidst this chaos, there stood a figure in exile, waiting, hoping, praying. Charles de Gaulle, miles away from his beloved France, would soon speak to its people, but would they listen? Was he their last hope, or simply a voice in the dark? In June of 1940, France stood on the edge of a precipice, unprepared for the terrifying speed of Germany's blitzkrieg. In less than a month, the French military, once considered one of the strongest in Europe, had crumbled beneath the weight of the German onslaught. The German army, a wave of modern warfare, tore through France with ruthless efficiency, using tanks, planes, and rapid infantry maneuvers in a way the French could scarcely comprehend. The surprise of the attack, coupled with poor strategic decisions and a lack of coordination, left the French defense in disarray. By June 14th, Paris had fallen, and the French government was in full retreat. For General Charles de Gaulle, the situation was a nightmare, but one that would only fuel his resolve. A young officer rising through the ranks, de Gaulle had always believed that the key to military success lay in speed, innovation, and a forward-thinking approach. In the chaos of the French retreat, he saw his opportunity not to flee or surrender, but to push forward, to resist in any way possible. But the French military command was in turmoil. Many leaders sought to make peace with the Germans, believing that surrender was the only path to survival. As France descended into panic, de Gaulle was determined to do the unthinkable, continue the fight, no matter the cost. He knew that the true battle was not just for the land, but for the soul of France itself. In Bordeaux, as the French High Command debated its next move, de Gaulle made a bold decision. He refused to accept the notion of surrender and set his sights on continuing the war from abroad. But how? What could one man, even a general, do when the entire country was collapsing around him? De Gaulle's journey would soon lead him to London, where his struggle would begin, not just as a soldier, but as the future leader of a nation in need of its soul to be rekindled. The question loomed: could de Gaulle rise from the ashes of France's defeat? Or was his resistance doomed to be nothing more than a fleeting act of defiance, lost in the shadows of a conquered nation? While the majority of the French leadership retreated in the face of defeat, General Charles de Gaulle was already planning a future that didn't include surrender. In the days following the fall of Paris, with the government abandoning the city to the Germans, de Gaulle's refusal to yield marked him as a stark contrast to many of his contemporaries. For most French officials, the writing was on the wall. They saw the German invasion as unstoppable, and the idea of continuing the fight seemed not only hopeless but dangerous. Yet in de Gaulle's mind, defeat was not an option. De Gaulle had always been a figure apart, a man who believed that France's strength lay in innovation. He had spent his career advocating for modernization in military tactics and doctrine. He was frustrated with the rigid, old-fashioned approach that had failed to prevent the invasion, he understood that traditional defenses were useless against the speed and precision of the German war machine. Unlike the generals around him, who seemed resigned to the idea of peace at any cost, de Gaulle believed that France's survival lay in its ability to adapt, to resist, to become something else entirely. He spent days wrestling with the idea of resistance while others scrambled to negotiate an armistice. The government, under the aging leadership of Marshal Philippe Pétain, appeared more interested in negotiating surrender terms with Nazi Germany than finding a way to continue the fight. For many in France, Pétain's resignation marked the end of their nation's resistance. Yet de Gaulle, who had been placed in charge of a small armored division, took an entirely different path. By the time the Vichy government was formally established in the southern town of Vichy, de Gaulle had already fled to London. There, in the heart of enemy territory, he would find the first key to his destiny. But the road to becoming France's symbol of resistance was not a simple one. De Gaulle's decision to escape, to create a free French movement, would be met with skepticism, both at home and abroad. In London, he found himself in a position of exile, disconnected from the real power struggles of the war. His military prowess had not yet translated into political support, and many in Britain were unsure about what to make of this man, speaking of continuing a war that seemed lost. He was a general without an army, a symbol of defiance with little tangible power. But his greatest strength was his unshakable belief in France's future. As he spoke passionately in front of a small crowd in London, addressing the French people through the BBC, the seeds of his movement were planted. He was not merely a man of the military. He was now a beacon for any Frenchman who refused to accept the crushing weight of surrender. Still, questions loomed large. Would anyone listen? Could de Gaulle's resistance grow from a solitary voice to a national movement? Was he simply the dreamer of an impossible future, or was he the only man who could reawaken France's fighting spirit? The war was far from over, and so was de Gaulle's struggle. The fate of France and his place in history was yet to be written. On the morning of June 18, 1940, Charles de Gaulle did something that would forever change the course of his life and the future of France. From his exile in London, he took to the airwaves, speaking directly to the French people over the BBC. His voice, though not widely known, would echo across the nation in a way no one could have predicted. This was no ordinary speech. It was a defiant call to arms, a rallying cry to the soul of a nation that was on the brink of collapse. In his impassioned speech, de Gaulle told the French people, "The battle may be lost, but the war is not over." He urged them to resist the Nazis, to fight on, to never surrender to the forces that had crushed their cities and desecrated their homeland. His words were full of fire and conviction, calling for all who had the strength to rise up and join him in the effort to liberate France. For many, this was a revelation. De Gaulle's broadcast gave hope where there had been none. It was the first flicker of resistance, the first moment when the French people, who had felt utterly betrayed by their government and military leaders, were given something to believe in. He spoke not just as a general, but as a leader of the nation's spirit, a leader who refused to accept the humiliation of defeat. Yet, despite the passion of his words, the impact of the broadcast was not universally embraced. Many inside France were skeptical. The government in Vichy, led by the newly installed Marshal Philippe Pétain, had already signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. For most French citizens, de Gaulle's broadcast came across as nothing more than a distant, theoretical appeal. After all, how could a man in exile, cut off from France and without an army, have any real influence over the outcome of the war? The French people were divided. In the occupied zones, some listened to de Gaulle's words with a sense of longing, clinging to the hope that perhaps there was still a way to defeat the Germans. But others, especially those under Vichy's rule, viewed de Gaulle as a troublemaker, a man who was asking the impossible. The Vichy government, already collaborating with the Germans, saw de Gaulle as a threat to their authority. His call to arms undermined the legitimacy of the collaborationist regime and further divided the country's fractured leadership. In Britain, de Gaulle's speech caused a stir as well. While Winston Churchill saw the value in de Gaulle's words, offering him support as a symbol of French defiance, there were others in the British government who questioned his ability to lead. De Gaulle was seen as a man of great ambition and little power, a symbolic figure whose promises might not be enough to rally a nation in such dire straits. But for de Gaulle, this was only the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, and resistance to his movement was strong both at home and abroad. Yet he had made his mark. He was no longer simply a general in exile. He was the face of Free France. The question remained, would he be able to unite the fragmented resistance, or was he destined to remain a voice in the wilderness? A man whose idealism would fade in the face of harsh reality. As de Gaulle's voice echoed across the airwaves, he found himself thrust into a precarious position. He was a symbol of resistance, but one without the means to back up his claims. The Free French movement, which he sought to build, was little more than an idea, a concept that needed much more than a broadcast to become reality. De Gaulle's struggle wasn't just against the German occupation, it was also against the political and military powers of both Britain and France, many of whom still didn't see him as a legitimate force for the future of the country. The Vichy government, established by Marshal Pétain, was now the recognized authority in France, even if it was essentially a puppet of Nazi Germany. While de Gaulle called on the French people to resist, the government he sought to replace was entrenched and in active cooperation with the German occupiers. The world outside France, including Britain and the United States, had to navigate their alliances carefully. Churchill, while supportive of de Gaulle, had his own concerns about the practicalities of his mission. The British saw in de Gaulle not just a symbol of defiance, but a potential thorn in their side. His refusal to accept anything but full French sovereignty made him a difficult partner for the British, who needed to maintain certain diplomatic relations in the delicate balancing act of the war. De Gaulle's position was further complicated by the reality of his situation. In London, he was isolated without a military force to speak of. His speeches to the French people were stirring, but they were not backed by anything tangible. The movement he wanted to create had no physical presence in France, no army, no formal leadership, and certainly no immediate resources. What he had, however, was an unyielding belief in the French spirit, a vision of a future in which France would not just recover from its defeat, but would rise to lead once more. This vision, however, was one that few were ready to embrace. His growing frustration with the British became evident. He was a man of principles, and he refused to bow to the whims of those who did not share his belief in a strong, independent France. De Gaulle's actions were beginning to draw the ire of many who saw him as an idealist, someone whose pursuit of sovereignty and pride might derail the practical steps needed to defeat the Germans. Churchill, though a supporter, found himself in a difficult position. De Gaulle's stubbornness, while admirable, was increasingly seen as a hindrance to unity among the Allies. While the British grappled with how to deal with de Gaulle, the French resistance movement inside France was fractured. It consisted of multiple factions with differing ideologies, from communists to royalists, and they were often more focused on internal struggles than on collaborating with de Gaulle. But despite the odds, de Gaulle began to pull together these scattered resistance groups, unifying them under the banner of Free France. His first real victory came when, in 1941, he was officially recognized by the British as the leader of the Free French government. Yet, the question of legitimacy remained a thorn in his side. He had no legal authority within France itself. His status as the legitimate leader of the French people was a fragile one, built on little more than the will of those who believed in his cause. He faced constant challenges from the Vichy government, as well as from various factions within the resistance that did not trust his authoritarian leadership style. De Gaulle's battle for legitimacy was not just a political struggle, it was a battle for the heart of France. As the Vichy government collaborated with the Germans, de Gaulle's Free France was constantly under siege, both from external forces and from internal divisions. His position seemed tenuous at best, and for a time it appeared that his defiance might remain a symbolic gesture, with little tangible impact on the war's outcome. Still, his resolve never wavered. He kept pressing forward, recruiting allies, speaking to the French people, and slowly but surely building the foundation for a government in exile that would, one day, reclaim France's place in the world. But as the struggle for legitimacy continued, de Gaulle faced a stark reality. He could not win this fight alone. To succeed, he would need to bridge the gap between the idealistic vision of Free France and the cold, pragmatic world of wartime alliances. The stakes were high. As de Gaulle sought to become the true leader of France, the question remained: would his efforts to build a legitimate government be enough to give the French people the hope they so desperately needed, or would his stubborn idealism be the very thing that doomed his movement to failure? As de Gaulle fought to establish the legitimacy of his Free French movement, the Vichy government, under the leadership of Marshal Philippe Pétain, began to solidify its control over the unoccupied zone of France. Officially formed after the armistice with Nazi Germany, Vichy France quickly became a symbol of collaboration, though its leaders preferred to call it cooperation. Marshal Pétain, a national hero from World War I, had assumed leadership with the promise of restoring order to a shattered nation. However, this promise came with a heavy price: the sacrifice of France's sovereignty and dignity in exchange for maintaining a semblance of power under Nazi rule. For many, the creation of the Vichy government was the ultimate betrayal. While Pétain was seen as a stabilizing figure by some, his willingness to work with the Germans marked him as a collaborator in the eyes of others. To the French resistance, which had already begun to form in the shadows of occupied France, Pétain's Vichy government was an unacceptable concession. In the minds of these resistors, It was not just a matter of politics, it was a matter of honor. By agreeing to the Nazi occupation, Pétain and his government allowed France to fall, tacitly endorsing the same regime that had defeated their country in a matter of weeks. The Vichy government's role in the war was complicated and morally ambiguous. While it officially maintained the facade of an independent France, its policies were shaped by the demands of the Nazi occupiers. France, under Petain's rule, handed over large numbers of Jews to the Nazis, participated in the repression of resistance movements, and even offered military support to the German war effort in the form of troops stationed in France's colonies. The moral cost of these actions would haunt France long after the war. In contrast, de Gaulle's Free French movement represented the antithesis of Vichy. Where Vichy sought collaboration and compromise, de Gaulle called for uncompromising resistance. But this was not just a philosophical or political divide. It was a deep national rift that would tear France apart. The question for the French people became, who truly represented the spirit of France? Was it the government in Vichy, which still controlled much of the territory and some of the military? Or was it the figurehead in London, who, despite lacking an army or formal authority, claimed to be the true voice of French independence? The tension between the Vichy government and de Gaulle's Free France was further complicated by the fact that many French citizens were deeply divided in their loyalties. Some saw de Gaulle as a hopeless idealist, too stubborn to recognize that surrender was the only option for a defeated France. Others saw the Vichy government as an expedient way to protect the remnants of French culture and identity, even if it meant bending the knee to the Germans. The moral grayness of Vichy's policies led to widespread confusion, and as the war dragged on, the French populace found itself caught between two competing visions for the future of their country: one of collaboration and survival, the other of resistance and defiance. The Vichy government, in many ways, served as a source of legitimacy for de Gaulle's Free French movement. Without Vichy, de Gaulle would have had no clear opposition, no regime to rally against and define himself in contrast to. But the very existence of Vichy also presented a major challenge to de Gaulle's authority. While the Allies supported him, he still lacked the recognition of France's political elites and a large portion of the French population, many of whom had come to see Vichy as the lesser evil in the face of German occupation. It was within this context of uncertainty and division that de Gaulle sought to build his movement. He needed not only to dismantle the Vichy regime's legitimacy, but also to offer an alternative vision of France's future, one that would heal the country's wounds and restore its place on the world stage. This was a monumental task, made even more difficult by the constant threat posed by Nazi forces and the ever-present shadow of collaboration. As de Gaulle's Free French movement began to grow, the Vichy government, meanwhile, began to impose harsher measures on the French people. The division between collaborators and resistors deepened, and the questions of loyalty, identity, and national pride became more pressing than ever. While de Gaulle tried to unify France under the banner of resistance, Pétain and his government, although outwardly committed to a French solution, had tied themselves too closely to the Nazi regime. This would leave an indelible stain on France's post-war reconstruction and lead to the moral reckoning that would define the country for decades to come. In this backdrop of moral ambiguity and national division, de Gaulle's leadership would be tested not only by the Germans, but by the very people he sought to save. Could he overcome the shadow of Vichy's collaboration, or was the stain of that government too deeply ingrained in the French psyche to be erased? The battle for the soul of France was not just a military one. It was a battle of identity, of values, and of what it meant to be French in the face of overwhelming adversity. While de Gaulle worked tirelessly from London to galvanize support for the Free French movement, he faced an enormous challenge in convincing a divided France that his vision was one worth following. France was shattered, not just by foreign invaders, but by internal conflicts. The lines between collaborators and resistors were drawn deeply, with many people unsure where their loyalties lay. The Vichy government, despite its collaboration with Nazi Germany, still controlled much of France and maintained a semblance of order. For many, that order was preferable to the chaos of resistance, especially when it seemed like the Free French were, at best, a distant hope. For de Gaulle, the creation of the Free French movement wasn't simply about continuing the fight, it was about redefining what it meant to be French. As France lay in ruins, de Gaulle saw this as an opportunity to revive the spirit of the nation. His rallies, broadcasts, and speeches were filled with patriotic fervor, invoking the tricolor and the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But this wasn't just about appealing to a nostalgic sense of national pride. It was about creating something new, something that would rise from the ashes of defeat and carry the torch of a liberated France forward. The Free French movement was an imperfect and fragmented entity. It was not a unified force from the outset, but rather a collection of individuals and factions united under de Gaulle's banner. From the early days of resistance in 1940, when scattered groups of French citizens took up arms against the occupiers, to the more organized efforts that followed, de Gaulle's task was to mold these disparate elements into a cohesive force. He faced resistance not just from the Vichy government, but from factions within the French resistance itself, each with its own agenda and ideological leanings. Communists, royalists, socialists, and Gaullists all fought in the shadows, sometimes at odds with one another, but united under the idea of French independence. In many ways, de Gaulle's greatest triumph was his ability to unite these groups, forging them into a single political and military entity. He recognized the importance of symbols in creating unity. His use of the tricolor flag, his speech in London calling for all Frenchmen to join the fight, and the establishment of the Free French National Committee were all designed to give France a single identity that could stand in opposition to both Nazi Germany and the Vichy government. De Gaulle was not merely fighting an external enemy, he was rebuilding France's very soul. But this was not a smooth process. The Free French had no major territory under their control, no cities, no strongholds to rally behind. They were a government in exile, operating from London and later Algiers, working alongside the British and the Americans, but without the solid footing that a legitimate government required. To make matters worse, de Gaulle's authoritarian style was often seen as a barrier to cooperation with other resistance groups. His insistence on leading from the front, his refusal to accept the influence of political figures or factions that didn't fall in line with his vision, alienated many within the resistance. At the same time, De Gaulle's vision for France was one of uncompromising independence. He rejected the idea of becoming a puppet of the Allies, and his relations with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt were often fraught with tension. Churchill, who had supported de Gaulle early on, was growing increasingly frustrated with de Gaulle's intransigence, especially when it came to negotiations over post-war French sovereignty. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was wary of de Gaulle's political ambitions, and there was a constant undercurrent of skepticism about his ability to represent all of France. Yet, despite these tensions, de Gaulle managed to maintain his standing with both nations, recognizing that his ability to stand firm would ultimately give him the legitimacy he needed to lead France once it was free from Nazi control. As the war wore on, de Gaulle's Free French movement began to gain more support, both within France and among the international community. The more France was divided between collaboration and resistance, the more de Gaulle's vision seemed to take on a moral and political clarity. The country's identity was at stake, and de Gaulle became the symbol of a France that would not bow to foreign domination. But the question remained, could he succeed in uniting a country so deeply fractured? His own authoritarianism, his insistence on absolute control, had earned him detractors both within the resistance and among his allied partners. Could de Gaulle's vision of a united, free France overcome the divisions within the country itself? Or would his pursuit of a singular French identity only deepen the rift between those who chose to collaborate and those who chose to resist? These questions lingered as the tide of the war began to turn, and de Gaulle's next challenge would be to bring France back to life, not just through the war effort, but by defining what it meant to be French in a world forever changed by occupation and struggle. As the war raged on, de Gaulle's life in exile was both a test of his resolve and a constant reminder of how far removed he was from the battlefields of France. The once proud general, now in the alien surroundings of London, faced the irony of being the head of the Free French forces while having little power or military might to back his claims. France, the country he had sworn to protect and restore, was under the heel of Nazi Germany, and his government in exile existed largely in the realm of political symbolism. In the context of World War II, his struggle was not just against the Germans, but against an international political reality that often ignored or underestimated him. His life in London was solitary and frustrating. Though he was supported by the British government, de Gaulle often found himself at odds with Churchill. The British Prime Minister had been one of the first to recognize de Gaulle's potential as a symbol of resistance, but their relationship was far from harmonious. Churchill, pragmatic as ever, was wary of de Gaulle's uncompromising demands for French sovereignty, especially when it conflicted with British strategic interests. De Gaulle's refusal to align himself too closely with the British, and his insistence on maintaining France's independence in the post-war world were seen by some as obstacles to the broader war effort. De Gaulle's insistence on leading from the front and his refusal to accept being a figurehead without real authority was both a strength and a weakness. He believed that France could not be rebuilt through collaboration or compromise. It had to be restored to its former glory, and this vision was non-negotiable. However, this stance made him difficult to work with. Churchill, while supportive, often saw de Gaulle as an obstacle to unity within the Allied camp. The tensions between the two leaders were palpable. Churchill needed a unified front to defeat the Axis powers, but de Gaulle's insistence on maintaining an independent French voice often threatened to derail this goal. The frustration was mutual, as de Gaulle saw Churchill's willingness to accommodate the Americans as a betrayal of French interests. In addition to his complicated relationship with the British, de Gaulle also faced tension with the United States. Franklin D. Roosevelt, initially skeptical of de Gaulle, had his own concerns about the general's authoritarian tendencies. Roosevelt was far more open to working with the Free French Resistance factions that had a more flexible, less dictatorial approach. De Gaulle, on the other hand, insisted that only he could truly represent France. His unyielding belief in his role as the rightful leader of France often put him at odds with the Allied powers, who were trying to find a way to deal with the complex political situation in France without alienating key factions within the resistance. Despite the external challenges, de Gaulle's determination only seemed to grow stronger. He knew that in order to be seen as the legitimate leader of France, he needed to prove that he could lead France's military efforts, not just speak to the hearts of the French people. His opportunity came in 1942, when he was able to convince the Allies to support a Free French force in North Africa, particularly after the British secured control of Algeria and Morocco. This was de Gaulle's first significant military victory in the war. He had earned the trust of the Allies enough to begin organizing and leading Free French troops. But this success did not bring him universal support. The French resistance, which had grown in number and strength, was still deeply divided. While many in the resistance saw de Gaulle as the rightful leader, others were hesitant to follow a man who had no real presence inside France and whose style of leadership could be seen as autocratic. De Gaulle's inability to unite the various factions of the resistance made it difficult for him to maintain full control over the Free French movement. Some resistance groups, particularly the Communists, disliked his authoritarianism and wanted a broader, more inclusive government in exile. Even as de Gaulle's leadership began to take hold, the question of his legitimacy continued to linger. He had managed to secure the support of the British and the Americans, but at what cost? Was he truly the voice of the French people, or was he simply a symbol that the Allies were willing to back for their own political convenience? The divide between the idea of de Gaulle as a symbol of national unity and the reality of his leadership in exile was never far from the surface. Despite these struggles, de Gaulle's resilience never faltered. He continued to push for French independence at every turn, even when faced with setbacks and criticisms from his own allies. He believed that the Free French movement was more than just an opposition force. It was the heart of the nation's future. His commitment to France's sovereignty was unwavering, even when it meant standing alone in the face of overwhelming opposition. As de Gaulle's exile continued, the question remained: could he truly reclaim France's rightful place in the world? Or would his time in exile, battling not just the Germans, but his own allies, prove to be the greatest test of his leadership? As the war entered its darkest hours, de Gaulle's vision for France and his place within that vision would face one final, monumental challenge. By the summer of 1944, the tides of war were beginning to shift in favor of the Allies. D-Day had taken place. and the Allied forces were making significant strides in their effort to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation. For de Gaulle, this moment represented both a personal and national turning point. His years in exile had been marked by a relentless battle for legitimacy, but the liberation of France would be his chance to prove that he was not just a voice of defiance in London, but the true leader of a liberated French nation. In the wake of D-Day, as Allied forces stormed Normandy and began their push inland, de Gaulle's Free French forces had an opportunity to join the fight for Paris. Yet, as the Allies advanced, the question of who would lead France's liberation remained contentious. The Americans, British, and even the French resistance factions all had their own visions of what a post-war France should look like. Would the French be allowed to reclaim their country on their own terms, or would they be forced to accept a foreign-imposed solution? De Gaulle, aware of the stakes, moved quickly to cement his authority. His insistence on leading France's liberation from the front was a powerful symbol of his leadership, but it was also a political maneuver. He was determined that the French people would not view the Allied forces as their sole saviors. France, de Gaulle believed, had to liberate itself, and the Free French forces under his command were the rightful bearers of that mission. For de Gaulle, the stakes were more than military success. They were a matter of national pride and identity. When the Allies entered Paris in August 1944, the city was in the final stages of being liberated from Nazi control. Paris had endured years of occupation, but the city's symbolic importance was still immense. De Gaulle knew that if France were to truly be liberated, Paris had to be restored to its rightful place as the heart of the nation. With a mix of military precision and political savvy, de Gaulle made his way to the capital. On August 25, 1944, de Gaulle stood in the streets of Paris, surrounded by crowds of jubilant French citizens. This moment, the liberation of Paris, was the culmination of years of resistance, hardship, and sacrifice. For de Gaulle, it was not just a military victory, it was the realization of his vision for France. He had always maintained that the French people, not their foreign allies, would be the true architects of their liberation. Now, as he marched down the Champs-Élysées, flanked by Free French soldiers, his triumph was complete. However, even in this moment of overwhelming victory, de Gaulle's leadership was not universally accepted. The complexities of French politics during and after the liberation would soon surface. Though the French resistance had fought valiantly in the streets, de Gaulle's arrival as the unquestioned leader of France was met with mixed emotions. The country, fractured by years of occupation and internal division, had to reconcile with the reality of its liberation. Many were grateful to de Gaulle for his unwavering commitment to their freedom, but others questioned whether he would be able to unite the country in the aftermath of its destruction. For de Gaulle, the stakes were clear. The liberation of France was a first step, but the real battle was just beginning. With Paris freed, he now had to guide a fractured nation toward rebuilding, while also navigating the delicate political landscape of the post-war world. The Allies, particularly the Americans and the British, were wary of de Gaulle's desire for French sovereignty, and the Soviet Union had its own interests in the post-war order. De Gaulle's challenge was not just military, it was diplomatic, as he sought to carve out a place for France as an independent and powerful force in the world. As de Gaulle stood before the crowd in Paris, He realized that his victory was as much about the future as it was about the past. France had endured a crushing defeat, but now it had the chance to rise again. His leadership would be tested in the coming months and years. Could he transform the symbols of resistance into the realities of reconstruction? Could he unite a country that had been divided not only by the occupation, but by competing visions of its future? The question remained. With France liberated, could de Gaulle truly rebuild the nation on his terms, or would his ambitions for a strong, independent France be undermined by the same divisions that had torn it apart during the war? The future of France and de Gaulle's place in it was far from secure. The liberation of France was a monumental achievement, but for de Gaulle, it was just the beginning. The true test of his leadership would not lie in the victory over the Nazis, but in his ability to guide a fractured nation through the delicate process of reconstruction and reassertion on the global stage. France had been shattered by years of occupation and internal division, and as de Gaulle took the reins of power, the weight of rebuilding a war-torn country fell squarely on his shoulders. De Gaulle's vision for post-war France was clear. He sought to create a strong, independent nation, free from both the shadow of the Axis powers and the influence of the Allies. His goal was not merely to restore France to its former state, but to elevate it to a position of global power, asserting French sovereignty in a world that was rapidly changing. This vision, however, was at odds with the realities of the post-war world. France had suffered greatly during the war, both in terms of human losses and economic destruction. The country was struggling to rebuild its infrastructure, its economy, and its international standing. At the same time, de Gaulle faced immense pressure from the United States and Great Britain to fall in line with their plans for a new world order, one that would favor cooperation and diplomacy over unilateral action. De Gaulle's idea of French sovereignty was rooted in a belief that France should not merely be a player in the new international system, it should be a leader. He was determined that France would not fall under the sway of the United States or the Soviet Union, both of whom were positioning themselves as the dominant powers in the post-war order. For de Gaulle, the essence of France's recovery lay in maintaining its independence, and he would not allow his country to become a mere satellite of either superpower. This vision was embodied in his creation of the Fifth Republic, which he envisioned as a strong centralized government that could steer France through the complex geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. But de Gaulle's vision was not just about politics. He also wanted to restore France's sense of national pride and identity. The occupation had been a humiliating experience for the French people, and de Gaulle sought to restore their confidence in themselves as a nation. This was reflected not just in his foreign policy, but in his domestic policies as well. De Gaulle advocated for a strong French economy, social welfare programs, and the restoration of France's cultural influence. He was deeply invested in the idea of a Great France, one that could rival the most powerful nations of the time. However, de Gaulle's vision was often in conflict with the political realities of a country recovering from war. The social divisions within France, exacerbated by the occupation, were profound. The rise of the Communist Party, the strength of the Vichy collaborators, and the continuing ideological battles from the war period all made it difficult to form a unified government. De Gaulle's authoritarian tendencies, which had served him well in the face of Nazi occupation, now created friction with those who wanted a more democratic and inclusive France. He was a man of strong convictions, and his insistence on control over the direction of the country sometimes alienated those who sought a more pluralistic approach to post-war governance. Externally, de Gaulle's vision for an independent France was not without its challenges. His relationship with the Allies was never entirely free of tension, and his defiance of both British and American policies during the war had left a lasting impression. While the United States and the United Kingdom recognized de Gaulle as the legitimate leader of Free France during the war, they had their own interests at heart in the post-war world. De Gaulle's refusal to align France too closely with either power was a source of consternation for the Allies, who hoped for a more cooperative France. Yet, de Gaulle's vision of independence was also appealing to many within France and abroad, who saw him as the only leader capable of restoring France's grandeur without compromising its sovereignty. The question of how to balance France's needs for recovery with de Gaulle's vision for a strong, independent France would be a constant source of tension. He was caught between the demands of rebuilding a country ravaged by war and the desire to reassert France's role on the global stage. His vision was bold, but it was also fraught with contradictions. Could he truly rebuild France into the strong, independent power he envisioned? Or would his commitment to sovereignty and his authoritarian tendencies ultimately isolate France from the rest of the world, making it harder to navigate the complexities of the Cold War? As de Gaulle moved forward in shaping the future of France, one thing was certain: his leadership would leave an indelible mark on the nation. His vision for a restored France was ambitious, and whether or not it was fully realized would depend on his ability to unite the country, reconcile its divisions, and chart a course through the uncertain waters of the post-war world. The future of France and de Gaulle's place in it remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: his legacy would be defined by the choices he made in these critical years of rebuilding. Charles de Gaulle's death in 1970 did not mark the end of his influence on France. If anything, it solidified his place in the nation's historical consciousness. His legacy was a complex one, filled with both admiration and controversy. But what remained undeniable was his role in shaping the modern French state. De Gaulle's life was one of profound transformation for his country, from the ashes of defeat to the heights of political and military resurgence. His influence permeated every aspect of post-war France, from its political structure to its identity as a global power. In the years following his death, de Gaulle's vision for France continued to shape the direction of the country. The Fifth Republic, which he had created and guided, remained the framework for France's political system. His belief in a strong, centralized government endured, and many of his policies, such as the emphasis on French independence in foreign affairs, continued to inform France's political discourse. His foreign policy, particularly his insistence on French autonomy within the framework of the Cold War, left a mark on the country's interactions with both the United States and the Soviet Union. His legacy as a leader who fiercely protected France's sovereignty resonated in French politics long after his death. However, de Gaulle's legacy was not without its critics. His authoritarian style and centralized approach to governance were sometimes seen as an obstacle to democratic pluralism. His refusal to embrace certain modernizing trends in French society, particularly regarding the evolving role of the youth and the rise of a more progressive cultural movement, left some questioning the long-term viability of his vision. The 1968 student protests, which shook France to its core, were a direct response to the rigidity of the French political establishment, and many saw de Gaulle's unwillingness to adapt to a rapidly changing world as a fundamental flaw in his leadership. Yet, for all the criticism, de Gaulle remained a towering figure in the eyes of many. His leadership during the war, his unyielding resistance to Nazi occupation, and his subsequent efforts to rebuild France earned him the reverence of a significant portion of the French populace. He was seen by some as the last truly independent statesman, a man who embodied the strength and resilience of France. His refusal to be influenced by either the American or Soviet powers, and his dedication to an independent French foreign policy, made him a hero for those who long for a France that stood proudly on its own, not as a mere follower of global superpowers. In the decades that followed, however, France's relationship with its own identity began to shift. The idea of a strong, independent France, under the direction of a single leader, became less appealing as the world grew more interconnected and globalized. The European Union, to which de Gaulle had been both a supporter and a critic, was evolving into a central force in European politics. The world was moving away from the concept of nation-states exercising complete sovereignty in favor of international cooperation and institutions. While de Gaulle had seen the European project as a way to restore France's strength, his vision of a Europe of sovereign nations was becoming increasingly outdated in the face of globalization. Despite these changing realities, de Gaulle's legacy endured. His assertion of French identity, his focus on rebuilding the nation after its darkest hours, and his belief in the power of the people to reclaim their country from foreign domination remained foundational in the way the French viewed their national history. The Fifth Republic, though altered over time, continued to serve as the bedrock of France's political system, and de Gaulle's personal imprint was felt in the way the nation approached issues of foreign policy, national identity, and even internal division. De Gaulle's influence also stretched beyond France's borders. As one of the most prominent leaders of the post-war era, his stance on French sovereignty and his role in shaping European geopolitics had far-reaching consequences. His attempts to balance French power between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, his veto of Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, and his leadership in the formation of the European Union were just a few of the ways de Gaulle impacted global politics. In many ways, de Gaulle saw himself as both the protector and the reformer of France's standing in the world. However, as time passed, the question remained, was de Gaulle a reluctant hero, or was he the architect of a vision for France that could never truly be realized? His unwavering commitment to a vision of French greatness was at once inspiring and isolating. His legacy was a mixture of both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in the way he brought France back from the brink of collapse, but tragedy in the way his vision became increasingly out of step with the changing world. The lasting image of de Gaulle, as a towering figure of resistance and resilience, will forever remain etched in the collective memory of France. His insistence on an independent, powerful France has made him a symbol of national pride for generations. Yet, as the world moves into the future, the true measure of de Gaulle's legacy will depend on how his vision, one of strength, sovereignty, and defiance, fits into a world where global cooperation increasingly takes precedence over national independence. In the end, de Gaulle's legacy is one of transformation. He was and will always be the man who guided France through its darkest hours, who reclaimed its dignity, and who shaped the future of the country with his resolute belief in its greatness. Whether history ultimately views him as a reluctant hero or a flawed visionary, de Gaulle's place in the story of France is indisputable. The France he left behind may be a different one from the one he dreamed of, but the nation he rebuilt will forever be his creation,